The psychology of German prisoners of war, held in American camps during World War II, was complex and often contradictory. Many of these men remained fiercely loyal to Nazi ideology and to Adolf Hitler personally, even after being captured and removed from the war. They maintained military discipline within the camps, enforced Nazi Party ideology among fellow prisoners, and in some cases actively threatened or attacked POWs who expressed doubts about the regime or showed friendliness toward their American captors. This loyalty created tension within POW camps and presented challenges for American administrators trying to manage these facilities. Into this environment, American guards and camp personnel sometimes introduced psychological operations designed to undermine Nazi ideology and Hitler's cult of personality. One of the most effective and controversial tactics involved using humor and mockery, including incidents where Americans dressed as Hitler and publicly ridiculed him in front of assembled German prisoners. Halloween in American POW camps during World War II was a strange cultural collision. German prisoners, most of whom had never experienced this uniquely American holiday, initially found the entire concept baffling. The idea of children dressing in costumes and going door to door, asking for candy, of adults attending costume parties, of decorations featuring ghosts and skeletons and jack-o'-lanterns. All of this seemed bizarre to men from a very different cultural background. When American guards first tried to explain Halloween to their German prisoners, the reaction was often incomprehension followed by dismissive laughter. What kind of people celebrated such a foolish holiday? This was the American culture they were supposed to fear? German officers in particular, many of whom maintained a sense of superiority despite their captivity, viewed Halloween celebrations with contempt. These were professional military men, often from aristocratic or upper-middle-class backgrounds who saw themselves as members of a warrior elite. They had been trained in the Prussian military tradition that emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and dignity. The idea of grown men dressing in silly costumes seemed to confirm their prejudices about Americans as unsophisticated, frivolous people who lacked the seriousness and martial spirit necessary for true military greatness. When they saw American guards preparing for Halloween celebrations, some German officers laughed openly, making jokes about American childishness and lack of military bearing. This contempt, however, presented an opportunity for psychological warfare. American camp administrators and intelligence officers recognized that the German officers' arrogance and their continued devotion to Hitler represented vulnerabilities that could be exploited. If you could make Hitler himself seem ridiculous, if you could transform the Führer from an object of reverence into an object of mockery, you might begin to crack the psychological hold that Nazi ideology maintained over the prisoners. Halloween, with its tradition of costumes and theatrical performance, offered a perfect opportunity for exactly this kind of operation. The planning for what became known in some camps as the Hitler mockery incident was careful and deliberate. American personnel understood they were taking a risk. Open mockery of Hitler in front of hardcore Nazi prisoners could provoke violence. It could create martyrs and actually strengthen devotion to the Führer among true believers. But if executed correctly, with the right mixture of humor and humiliation, it might plant seeds of doubt and make Hitler seem less like a godlike leader and more like a flawed, even ridiculous human being. The preparations were made in secret. American guards and camp personnel, possibly including some anti-Nazi German POWs, who could be trusted to keep quiet, created costumes and props. Someone obtained or created a uniform resembling Hitler's, complete with the characteristic brown shirt, swastika armband, and iron cross. A fake mustache was prepared, styled in Hitler's distinctive toothbrush shape. Perhaps most importantly, someone who could mimic Hitler's speaking style and mannerisms was selected to play the role. This might have been an American guard with theatrical experience, or possibly a German-speaking American intelligence officer. or even an anti-Nazi German POW willing to participate in mocking the Führer. The performance was scheduled for Halloween night, when the entire camp population would be assembled. German POW camps in America typically had regular formations where prisoners were counted and announcements were made. This particular formation was announced as a special assembly, with all prisoners required to attend. The German officers and enlisted men gathered, expecting perhaps some announcement about camp policies or work details. What they got instead was theater designed to humiliate and undermine. The lights came on, illuminating a small stage area. Music began playing, possibly a distorted version of German military marches or Nazi anthems. Then, the Hitler impersonator appeared. The costume was deliberately exaggerated, the mustache comically oversized, the uniform slightly wrong in ways that made it seem like a cheap imitation. The performer began speaking, mimicking Hitler's rhetorical style, but filling the speech with absurdities, contradictions, and self-aggrandizing nonsense that exaggerated the Führer's actual speeches to the point of farce. The performance might have included scenes showing Hitler as a coward, perhaps hiding under a desk while bombs fell, or as a buffoon making ridiculous strategic decisions. It might have featured mock rants about subjects rendered absurd through exaggeration. The performer might have strutted around the stage in an exaggerated goose step, fallen over comically, or engaged in slapstick that reduced Hitler from terrifying dictator to clownish fool. Other American personnel, also in costume, might have played roles as fawning Nazi officials, themselves presented as incompetent sycophants. The initial reaction from the German prisoners was shock and outrage. For men who had grown up under Nazi rule, who had been trained to view Hitler as Germany's savior, who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to the Führer, seeing him mocked in this way was profoundly disturbing. Some prisoners shouted in anger, some tried to look away or cover their ears. The hardcore Nazi believers in the camp were furious, seeing this as a desecration of everything they held sacred. The officers who had laughed at American Halloween customs just days earlier were no longer laughing. Their faces showed rage, humiliation, and in some cases something that might have been fear, the fear that comes when something you've held as absolute and unquestionable is suddenly revealed as merely human and vulnerable to ridicule. But not all the prisoners reacted with anger. Some, particularly younger enlisted men who had been conscripted into military service and who had never been committed Nazis, showed different reactions. There were suppressed smiles, quickly hidden when other prisoners looked their way. There were nervous laughs that escaped despite efforts to maintain stoic expressions. There was, in some faces, something that looked like relief, or even liberation, as if seeing Hitler mocked gave permission to thoughts and doubts that had been buried under years of propaganda and enforced loyalty. The performance continued despite the protests and anger from the prisoner audience. American guards made clear that the assembled Germans were required to watch, that this was not optional, that any prisoner who tried to leave or cause disruption would face disciplinary action. The Hitler impersonator continued his act, growing more exaggerated and ridiculous as the performance went on. The message being sent was clear. Your Führer is not a god. He is a man, and not a particularly impressive one. He can be laughed at. His ideology can be questioned. The regime you served has brought you to this place, prisoners far from home, while the man you followed poses and rants and leads Germany to destruction. The aftermath of the performance was complex and varied, depending on which camp and which specific incident we're discussing, as variations of this kind of psychological operation were attempted in multiple locations. In some camps, hardcore Nazi prisoners attempted to organize resistance or retaliation, threatening anti-Nazi prisoners, who they suspected of collaborating with the mockery. Camp administrators had to increase security, and in some cases segregate the most fanatical Nazi believers to prevent violence. There were incidents of prisoners attacking others they believed had shown amusement during the Hitler mockery, viewing any positive reaction as treason against the Führer. But there were also quieter effects that became apparent over time. Some prisoners began asking American guards questions about the war's progress, about what was really happening in Germany, about whether the propaganda they had been fed was actually true. Some requested access to American newspapers and magazines, wanting to see information that wasn't filtered through Nazi ideology. Some began cooperating with re-education programs that American authorities had established to try to denazify the prisoner population. The mockery had not instantly converted committed Nazis into Democrats, but it had created openings for doubt, for questioning, for the possibility that everything they had believed might not be true. American intelligence officers who debriefed prisoners after such performances reported that the mockery was often more effective than straightforward arguments or propaganda. Telling a committed Nazi that Hitler was wrong or evil would simply provoke defensive reactions, reinforce existing beliefs, but making Hitler seem ridiculous, transforming him through humor from an object of reverence to an object of mockery, attacked the emotional and psychological foundations of Nazi loyalty in ways that direct argument could not. Laughter and ridicule are powerful weapons against authority that depends on maintaining an image of strength and infallibility. The use of Halloween specifically for this kind of operation was strategically clever. The holiday provided cover, a cultural context that made the performance seem like just another example of strange American customs, rather than a calculated psychological warfare operation. German prisoners who might have recognized and resisted obvious propaganda could be caught off guard by what seemed at first like just American foolishness. By the time they realized what was happening, they had already been exposed to the mockery, and the damage to Hitler's mystique had been done. The contrast between the German officers' initial laughter at Halloween as a foolish American custom and their rage and humiliation when that same custom was used to mock Hitler illustrates a broader dynamic in the POW camps. The German prisoners often underestimated their captors, viewing Americans as culturally inferior, militarily weak, and intellectually unsophisticated. This contempt made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of psychological operations that Americans then deployed against them. The same Americans they had dismissed as children playing dress-up proved capable of using those costumes and that theatrical tradition to deliver devastating attacks on Nazi ideology. The ethical questions surrounding these kinds of psychological operations were debated at the time and remain interesting to consider. The Geneva Conventions required that prisoners of war be treated humanely and protected from insults and public curiosity. Did forcing prisoners to watch a mocking performance of their leader constitute a violation of these protections? American authorities argued that it did not, that no physical harm was involved, that prisoners were simply required to attend an assembly where a theatrical performance occurred. The performance didn't single out individual prisoners for humiliation. It targeted an ideology and a political leader, not the prisoners themselves as individuals or as German soldiers. But the psychological impact was real and intentional. The goal was to humiliate, to create doubt, to undermine beliefs that prisoners held dear. This was psychological warfare conducted against captive audiences who couldn't leave or avoid exposure. Some critics argued this crossed ethical lines, using captivity to force prisoners to consume propaganda and mockery. Defenders countered that de-Nazification was necessary and justified, that Nazi ideology was so evil and had caused so much suffering that aggressive efforts to dismantle it, even among prisoners of war, were not just acceptable but morally required. The long-term effects of these mockery incidents are difficult to measure with precision. Post-war studies of German POWs who had been held in America showed that many returned to Germany with more favorable views of the United States and democracy than prisoners who had been held elsewhere. Some became active participants in rebuilding democratic Germany after the war. Whether the Halloween mockery of Hitler specifically contributed to these outcomes is impossible to determine conclusively, but it was part of a broader American effort to use the POW experience to begin denazifying German prisoners. What is clear is that the incident, and others like it, represented a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare. The Americans recognized that authority and ideology depend heavily on maintaining certain images and emotional responses. Hitler's power over his followers rested not just on fear or material benefits, but on a carefully constructed cult of personality that presented him as a superhuman figure destined to lead Germany to greatness. Anything that punctured this image, that revealed Hitler as merely human, or even ridiculous, weakened the psychological bonds that tied followers to the regime. The use of humor and mockery as weapons against totalitarian ideology has a long history and continued relevance. Authoritarian regimes typically cannot tolerate being laughed at because humor undermines the fear and reverence they depend on. This is why such regimes typically punish mockery of leaders severely, why satirists and comedians in totalitarian countries risk imprisonment or worse, why propaganda emphasizes the dignity and power of the leader while treating any criticism as treasonous. The Americans understood this dynamic and weaponized it, using Halloween costumes and theatrical performance to deliver attacks on Nazi ideology that might have been more effective than any amount of conventional propaganda. For the German officers who had laughed at Halloween just days before the Hitler mockery, the experience must have been profoundly disturbing. They had dismissed American culture as frivolous and childish, only to discover that this same culture could be turned against them with devastating effectiveness. Their laughter had been premature and revealed their own vulnerability. They had underestimated their captors, and that mistake had consequences. The foolish American holiday they had mocked became the vehicle for mocking everything they believed in, and they were powerless to stop it or escape it. The Halloween Hitler mockery incidents represent a fascinating and little-known aspect of the American POW experience during World War II. They show how cultural traditions can be adapted for psychological warfare purposes, how humor and ridicule can be powerful weapons against ideology, and how the apparently frivolous can become deadly serious when wielded with intelligence and purpose. They also illustrate the complex psychological dynamics within POW camps, where captors and captives engaged in ongoing struggles over ideology, loyalty, and identity that went far beyond simple imprisonment and continued long after the physical fighting had ended for those particular soldiers.